contents of the royal palaces in Hanover, which included a good deal of silver. Well, a nasty standoff developed. Queen Victoria struggled to get it back, but to no avail. And Ernest, to be on the safe side, had all the plate that he had taken into his possession engraved with these initials, which stand for Ernest Augustus Fidecomis, entailed to the estate of Ernest Augustus. And we can form an idea of the sheer scale of these holdings from this rather remarkable photograph taken for a family celebration in 1868. Although, trust me, there was much more to it than this. There was, for example, considerable quantities of silver furniture, enormous mirrors, tables, girandoles, chairs, and so on, all covered in sumptuous plates of silver. Well, it's soon after the time of the 1802 basket that what we call the Regency Style first makes its appearance. This second wave of neoclassicism saw heavy luxury plate return to centre stage. And like the first wave, its character from about 1805 was partly influenced by these proselytizing books. Probably the most influential of these was Charles Heathcote Tatham's Designs for Ornamental Plate, which was published in 1806. This was, in large measure, a reaction against the Adam style, which Tatham accused of promoting insubstantial forms and the wrong sort of ornament. And in the rather pompous language of the time, he wrote, and I must quote this passage, he wrote, "It has been much lamented by persons high in rank and eminent for taste that modern plate has much fallen off, both in design and in execution, from that formerly produced in this country. Indeed, the truth of this remark is obvious, for instead of massiveness, the principal characteristic of good plate, light and insubstantial forms have prevailed to the utter exclusion of all ornament whatever." Well, it's a point of view, I suppose. In a way, he had a point. And although Adam had turned to classical architecture for his ornament, his shapes came more from the Renaissance than from ancient Rome. What Tatham advocates is a much more archaeological approach, and he champions the design that follows the designs that follow the engravings of Piranesi, which were based on real ancient marbles, such as these two here. This principle of massiveness naturally made the grandest Regency plate very expensive, especially when it was gilded. But the aristocratic landowning classes could afford this because they were enjoying a period of unprecedentedly high land rents at the time. So they could aspire to displays like this. This is a slide from a Christie's sale catalogue of the early 1970s showing the collection of Silver-GIlt that was being sold by the Earl of Harewood at the time. So this was one collection. The Regency style isn't known as such just because it flourished in the time of the Regency. The Prince Regent himself was its leading and most extravagant champion, putting together an enormous collection known as the Grand Service. This was acquired between 1806 and 1810, and it cost a staggering sum of £70,000, which I won't try to convert that into modern money because I find these things never really work. But trust me, it practically bankrupted the royal finances. And there it is. This slide shows a state banquet at St. George's Hall in Windsor Castle early in Victoria's reign, and there she is processing into dinner there. And the table is absolutely groaning in Silver-GIlt, and the buffet is awash with this magnificent set-piece display. One of the most remarkable features of this style, given its diverse resources, is its cohesiveness. And this was made possible by Rundle, Bridge and Rundle, the royal goldsmiths, who between about 1805 and 1825 totally dominated the market for display silver. The partners, Philip Rundle and John Gawler Bridge, were brilliant salesmen, and they maximised on the spin-off from the royal orders. They, in a way, created a kind of expectation of grandeur. They turned commissioning plate into a kind of patriotism, and they had a big enough stock that they carried that they were able to hire out plate for big public occasions, which of course in itself was good for business. One of the most famous of these occasions was an event called the Three Monarchs Banquet, which was held in London's Guildhall, and you can see there in 1814, in the centre is the Prince Regent, and he is flanked by the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia. And they had invited, obviously, everybody who was anybody to this grand dinner. And you can see that there are vast quantities of silver and silver-gilt, all of which was hired in for the occasion. The key to Rundle's success was absolute control over quality and design. They didn't have a manufacturing workshop of their own, and all the manufacturing was outsourced, but they did maintain their own design studio. And the main suppliers were Paul Storr and Benjamin Smith, who around 1807, between them, were employing about 1,000 people, which is a huge industry. And although their marks appear on many of the pieces in the exhibition at Sunnylands, they were required to work absolutely to Rundle's exact specifications in the way that a contractor is expected to work to the exact specifications of the architect. And the result was that the work of these two different workshops was quite indistinguishable from each other. The real thing to look for here is not the marks, but Rundle's stamped signature, which you can see below, and it reads rather grandly spelt out in Latin, Rundle Bridge et Rundle orifices regis et principi Wallii fecerunt, which means, I'm sure, hardly tell you, Rundle Bridge and Rundle, goldsmiths to the King and Prince of Wales, made this. A closer look at one of the trays in the Annenberg collection gives a telling idea of how rigorous this quality control was. If we go in a little closer, the border is designed as vine leaves and bunches of grapes, each of which have been separately cast or die-struck and then soldered together onto an armature of tendrils that you can see on the back. The handles and even the fawn feet, practically invisible when the tray is displayed, have been separately cast, beautifully finished, and soldered on. And there is one of the feet, rather elegantly and inventively designed as a bacchanalian mask with vines in his hair and fawn's feet below. The design studio at Rundle's cost the firm about £1,000 a year to run. They sought out and bought old ornament prints and contemporary ornament prints, and they employed talented artists and draftsmen. Some of their lines were really exact copies of engravings by Piranesi, such as this wine cooler. You can see it follows in every detail the Piranesi print. Others were more loosely derived. This candelabrum, for example, is a highly original design, but the inspiration for its base is surely the Piranesi engraving of a monumental Roman piece on the right. Some of the best neoclassical designs were the work of a French artist called Jean-Jacques Boileau, who was employed by Rundle's from about 1802 and produced designs that brilliantly combined motifs of ancient Greek, Roman, and Egyptian origin. For example, these two drawings for a wine cooler and an urn have been combined, perhaps in a third drawing that's lost, we don't know, to produce this wonderful statuesque urn that is eclectic, but at the same time, I think, powerfully unified in its design. And the merging of these three cultures, the Greek, the Roman, and the Egyptian, in one piece is, I think, best seen in this soup tureen, which is one of a set of 4 in the Gilbert collection, and one of which is actually on loan at the moment at LACMA in LA, so if you're ever over there, you can go and have a closer look at it yourself. You see, you've got Egyptian sphinxes forming those feet, the flanking the stem there. You've got Greek motifs in the handles with the figure of Artemis, and then you've got an evocation of Romanness in that frieze of sacrifices going on beneath the lip. And then you've got, again, another winged sphinx beneath that detail on the body. So it is a wonderful combination of these 3 completely different cultures. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the splendid set of candlesticks in the Annenberg collection, hallmark for 1807, were also designed by Boileau. They have all the features of clean lines and well-judged classical details that one associates with his work. Let's get in again a little bit more closely. I mean, I think they're superbly finished, and there's a marvelous balance between the ornamented and the plain surfaces. Another piece from the Boileau stable is probably this soup tureen, again up the road. It's one of Rundell's more popular lines, this design of tureen, but this one is a bit of a mystery. It has the royal lion and badge on the cover, but that seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with the coat of arms that's engraved on the body. This is for a family called Beechcroft, but I've been unable to find out which individual they're for, or what connection there might be with the royal household or the royal service that would have entitled him to put that on the cover. Not only that, but it looks, you can see in this slide, it does look as if the coat of arms cuts through the gilding to reveal the silver beneath, implying that they were done at a later date. An important group within the design studio at Rundell's were the sculptors. William Theed, for example, designed this dramatic salt cellar, which is in the British Royal Collection. But the leading figure among the sculptors was John Flaxman, and he designed some of the most celebrated and massive pieces for the Prince Regent, which are still in the Royal Collection today, such as this great candelabrum and the piece on the right, which you will recognize immediately as an ice bucket, I'm sure. The candelabrum from the floor there stands about this high, and the ice bucket is about this size. So you get a lot of ice. You might conceivably find such pieces a little too grand for comfort, but some of Flaxman's designs are extraordinarily beautiful, especially the Theocritus vase and the Shield of Achilles. Here is the vase and Flaxman's drawing for it. The vase itself is in the Royal Collection and the drawing is in the British Museum. And I just feel that the lines of this piece are very, very subtle and very beautiful. Yes, they're grand, but they've got a loveliness to them as well. The Shield was one of his most important works for Rundell's. And unusually for them, this was not made on order, but it was made as a speculation. And in fact, Flaxman worked on it for about 12 years from 1810, doing many, many drawings. This is just one of his drawings, and then working up the models for the relief scenes. It shows Apollo in the center, riding his chariot, and it's surrounded by a series of Homeric battle scenes and processions that are worked in a very subtle, extremely low relief. In all, 5 copies of the shield were made. The first one was sold to George IV and is still in the Royal Collection. And I'm happy to tell you that in this case, if you don't know it already, that one of these, this one, in fact, is practically on your doorstep and is in the Huntingdon Library and Art Gallery in San Marino, where it looks really quite beautiful. So I do urge you to go and see it. Well, powerful though Rundles were in the Regency period, it would be a mistake to think that they had the field completely to themselves. And I'd like to mention just 1 or 2 of their competitors, if only because it has a direct bearing on the Annenberg collection. Their main competitors were another firm of retailers, Green, Ward and Green, who in fact took on Benjamin Smith, one of Rundle's silversmiths, in 1817. They were a force to be reckoned with, largely because they enjoyed the patronage of the Duke of Wellington. And interestingly, one of their most important commissions was another shield. This was, that's the one in Huntingdon again. But this shield is known as the Wellington Shield. It was presented to the Duke by the merchants and bankers of the City of London in 1822. And it's a direct answer, if you will, to the Shield of Achilles. In the center, we have got, this is a drawing for it. In the center, we've got the Duke himself, rather than Apollo, crowned by victory, trampling on anarchy, discord, and tyranny, as he was used to doing, while surrounding the whole thing are a series of reliefs depicting his great military triumphs. This shield was designed and modelled by Thomas Stothard, who had also worked for Rundles, and his drawings, we can see 2 here, still survive. One of Rundle's most interesting competitors, and very different altogether, was another retailer by the name of Kensington Lewis. He worked in a very different style that was, in a way, well outside the mainstream. Like Green, Ward and Green, he flourished because he had a highly placed patron. On this occasion, Frederick, Duke of York, younger brother of the Prince Regent. And you only have to look at this Monteith bowl made for the Duke of York in 1820 to see how unlike Rundle's work it is. It has its classical elements, to be sure, and the high relief battle scenes around the centre there seem to be derived from an ancient Roman sarcophagus. But there are lots of other things going on too. 17th century details around the top and mid-18th century high rococo around the foot. I hope you can read that in that slightly fuzzy image there. This source boat goes right back to, well, let me tease you for a moment. I mean, you might well look at this source boat and say, well, that is very, very sort of Victorian taste, isn't it? And in a way it is. But it is copying, as you can clearly see, this print on the right-hand side. And if I told you that that was not made in the 19th, 18th, or even 17th century, but in the mid-16th century, that is the case. And this engraving was done in Antwerp in about 1540. Others of Kensington Lewis's work draw on other kinds of sources. Really, it hardly matters what. Green, Ward and Green and Kensington Lewis hardly survived the passing of their great patrons, but the other firm I want to mention lasted much longer. Garrard's trace their origin back to the 1720s and survive in a reduced way in London to this day. The business that evolved eventually into Garrard's started with George Wicks in 1720, and he was one of the most successful goldsmiths in town at that time. And we actually have an important example from this period here in the Annenberg collection in the form of 7 magnificent dishes of 1739 by Wicks, and which I'm going to return to a little later on. Well, Garrard's did not have quite the same profile as Rundell's during the latter's heyday. Frankly, no one did. But they were a great force to be reckoned with in the days after Rundell's demise, and by the 1840s were one of the 2 or 3 leading retailers in London. The pair of wine coolers in the Annenberg collection date from 1843, and they're fascinating objects. Like so much of Rundell's silver, they look back to ancient prototypes, specifically the famous Warwick vase, which was the subject of another of Piranesi's prints, and there it is. But whereas Rundell's vases replicated the print exactly, Garrard's have morphed it into something quite different. The profile and distinctive handles remain the same. Do I have a detail of the handle there? No, I don't. Let's stay with the main image. But the lion's pelts and the masks have gone, and they've been replaced by vines. And, of course, the base is completely different. And the way in which the base is different brings me neatly to the last area I want to touch on in this lecture, for the base of the wine coolers are all about heraldry. This, of course, is the image that you spent half an hour staring at before I started. Heraldry has its origins in medieval warfare, when knights were covered in armour from head to foot, and it was important to be able to distinguish friend from foe in the mayhem of the battlefield. So a knight would develop his own unique blazon, which would decorate his upper body and shield. The coat of arms and an accompanying motif for his helmet, known as the crest. And this would then be inherited by his sons, and in time was adopted into a wider sphere, and you find coats of arms on paintings, on buildings, on furniture, and so on. Well, over the centuries, the whole subject became infinitely more complicated, and this is not the time for a general lecture on heraldry. But it occurred to me that it might interest you to know something of what the magnificent coats of arms on the Annenberg silver tell us about their original owners. Not only that, but how they tell us about their original owners. So let's take the arms on the coolers. They are very prominent and very finely done. They show the arms of the man himself on the left-hand side in the first and fourth quarters, coupled with those of his wife on the right. There's his wife's arms. He was William Vane, 1st Duke of Cleveland, and his wife was Elizabeth Russell. But you might say that the Duke was vain in name and vain in nature, for his arms tell us a good deal more than that about who exactly he was. He was, for example, proud of his descent from Charles II, even if it was through an illegitimate son. And so the royal arms are displayed on the other 2 quarters of his shield. And although illegitimacy was generally seen as something of a stigma in the upper classes, as you can imagine, having the king for your father, even though your mother was not his wife, was seen as an honourable exception to this. And there was even a heraldic way of expressing the fact. It was known as a bar sinister, and it's prominently placed across the middle of the royal arms here. Do you see? Well, Vane was made a duke in 1833, and the arms are surmounted by a ducal coronet, as well as being flanked by the heraldic supporters that he was entitled to as a member of the nobility. I'm referring there to the 2 sculptural animals seated on either side of the arms themselves. Finally, the Duke was a Knight of the Garter, the premier order of chivalry in England, and his shield is surrounded by the Garter itself, with its motto, Honi soit, qui mal y pense, together with his family motto beneath, Nec timere, nec timide, which means neither rashly nor timidly. So there's a lot of baggage here. And I think you'll agree it's a quite splendid visual expression of the identity of a man whose full title was, wait for it, Sir William Vane, K.G., Duke and Marquis of Cleveland, Earl of Darlington, Viscount and Baron Barnard of Barnard Castle, and Baron Raby of Raby Castle in the bishopric of Durham. That was him. No less conspicuous are the arms on the vine pattern tray, which are those of Charles Pelham, 2nd Baron Yarborough, and his wife, Henrietta Simpson. They were married in 1806, so the tray was probably commissioned to set them up in married life. And they must have been set up pretty grandly, because the tray is just part of a substantial service which included the 8 candlesticks and 2 butter dishes in this collection, all of which are engraved with either the Pelham coat of arms or the crest. The crest is that little motif you can see at the top. The 1970 sale catalogue of the Fay Plone collection, at which these pieces were acquired, includes a good deal more from the service too. There is the photograph from the sale catalogue. There's a tea service, 4 sugar vases, dinner plates, entree dishes, even larger candlesticks, toast racks, and so on. Quite rather like the group from the Earl of Harewood, quite an impressive display, I think you'll agree. Well, like the wine coolers, the heraldry here is deadly serious. His wife's arms are shown in pretense, that is to say the smaller coat right in the middle. This is a way of showing that his wife was a heraldic heiress, and like her husband's, her own arms are shown quarterly. Quarters always refer to something, some important aspect of one's lineage. In her case, the 2nd and 3rd quarters, a lion with 10 roundels, are for Bridgeman, and that refers to her family connections with the Earl of Bradford. But interestingly, on such a grand piece, the engraver has made a mistake. Looking back at her husband's arms, the 2nd and 3rd quarters, which are for the Anderson family, another family in the Pelham pedigree, they've been incorrectly drawn. On the tray, they're just shown as 3 crosses, as you can see by my red arrow, whereas in an official publication of the arms, they're shown above and below an additional motif, which is a chevron, and you can see it there from the book. But the tray was made, the point is that these things mattered, and one could well imagine the Baron being displeased. Incandescent might be a better word, when he saw it. Interestingly, when I saw the silver yesterday in the flesh for the first time, I noticed that the candlesticks have got also the coat of arms engraved on them, but there it's correct, it's got the chevron. So I think possibly the candlesticks were supplied second after a good deal of fuss had been made. But that brings me to another point about these arms, namely that they are shown with a baron's coronet above. But the tray was made in 1806, whereas Pelham didn't actually inherit the title until his father's death in 1823. So I wonder if the tray was sent back and the engraving slightly tweaked at the time in 1823 to reflect his new elevated status. It's quite likely, and this sort of thing happened fairly often. Well, 2 more pieces, and then I'm going to stop. The first, this tray, I've left till now because it is heraldically fascinating and absolutely magnificent, perhaps the single most magnificent piece in the collection. It's the same design as the other, but it's grander still because of its engraving. This shows the royal arms of George III, complete with crown, supporters, motto, and the garter that we've seen before. But most unusually, it shows the chain of the garter order together with the George itself, the pendant figure of St. George and the dragon hanging below. And like all other aspects of their production, Rundell's made sure that their heraldic engraving was of the very